On a freezing December night in 1990, a young woman walked the final few yards towards her home in Cardiff, but never made it through the front door. What happened in those final moments remains one of the most unsettling mysteries South Wales police had ever faced, sparking an investigation that would stretch across an entire decade. When 26-year-old Geraldine Palk failed to return home after her work's Christmas party, her friends were confused, her family was worried, and within hours whispers began spreading through Fairwater. Had she run into trouble on her short walk home? Had she met someone? Or had she simply chosen not to say goodbye before slipping quietly into the night? As detectives traced her last known movements through busy night spots, taxi queues, and the quiet residential streets she knew so well, a far darker story began to surface. One involving frantic appeals, national TV reconstructions, an unidentified man seen running from the crime scene, and a tiny piece of evidence that would later prove crucial. In this episode of British Murders with Stuart Blues, I take you back 35 years to discuss those final hours, the sprawling manhunt that followed, the forensic breakthroughs that shaped the case, and the devastating toll it took on Geraldine's family. Before we dive in, please make sure you hit follow on your podcast player of choice and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. It's a zero-cost way to support the show and helps it reach more people interested in true crime. If you'd prefer to listen ad-free and a day early, plus gain access to a whole heap of exclusive content, including episodes not released on the main feed, head to patreon.com/British Murders and join my growing community. This time of year always hits different, doesn't it? It's Christmas season. The holidays have arrived, and it's meant to be this cozy, joyful season. And for a lot of people, it is. But it's also a time when plenty of folk struggle. Old memories come flooding back. Loved ones don't have a seat at the table anymore. And some families go into December carrying heartbreak they never asked for. So, as you're listening to this week's story, just keep in mind the people who knew and loved the person at the centre of it. For them, this time of year will never feel the same again. And for many like them across the country, Christmas isn't always the twinkly, fairy-lit picture we sometimes make it out to be. It's important we hold those people in our thoughts. This week we're heading back to Wales, a place I have a love-hate relationship with purely from a pronunciation perspective. Specifically, we're in the capital city of Cardiff, which is not only the birthplace of Roald Dahl, but also Britain's wettest city. And we're talking about a young woman called Geraldine Palk. A lot of her close friends and family knew her as Jerry, but as always, I'm going to omit from using that nickname out of respect, because I didn't know her. Geraldine was 26 years old during our main timeline, which is in 1990, having been born on February 12, 1964 at St David's Hospital in Cardiff. She grew up in the district of Fairwater, which is in West Cardiff, and lived with her mum and dad in their home at Bracken Place. Fairwater's a proper community-driven sort of area, very residential, down-to-earth, the sort of place where people know each other intimately. Her dad, Leslie, or Les, was a retired steelworker who'd spent his life welding for a living, and her mum, Cynthia, worked as a nurse in the maternity ward at Llandoch Hospital. The married couple had 3 kids in total, Geraldine being the middle child, and in 1990 she was the last one still living at home with her parents. Her older brother Neil had moved out years before and was living in Bather, and her younger sister Alison was also married and settled in another area of Cardiff. Geraldine had a really close bond with her siblings. She'd been a bridesmaid at Neil's wedding back in 1982, the wedding actually fell on her 18th birthday, and she'd been a bridesmaid at Alison's wedding in June 1990 also. Neil loved and trusted his sister so much, he asked her to be godmother to his kids when they arrived years later. But life wasn't always straightforward for Geraldine. When she was little, she was seriously poorly for a good while. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with her at first, but eventually they found out she had a heart defect. When she got excited, her lips and skin would turn blue, and she couldn't run around like the other kids could. She struggled to breathe easily, so missed out on lots of sporting activities, which absolutely crushed her. When she was 10, she had a serious operation to correct the condition, which was essentially a leaking heart valve that was letting blood into her lungs. After that successful surgery, though, she was like a different kid. She hit the ground running after her recovery, throwing herself into all sorts of sports. She became captain of a local baseball team and played for loads of sides over the years: Fairwater, Keith Brown Shipping, Tremorfa Video, and later on at the Cardiff Nefertiti Ladies, which had been renamed from Fairwater, where she'd already spent her first 8 seasons. Geraldine typically played fourth base or outfield and won a string of trophies throughout her amateur career. She also loved horse riding, that excited her, as did basically anything active. At school, she first went to Peter Lee Primary and then moved on to Cantonian High School. But she was much more into sport than schoolwork. So, once she'd sat her CSEs, which were basically the end of school exams before GCSEs came in, she left to go and work in an office. Not long after that, the grandparent she was incredibly close to passed away. Their deaths devastated her, but she was one of those people with a natural spark, even in such a dark situation. She was bubbly and down to earth, the sort of person who bounced back even when life threw something heavy at them. She later did a business and secretarial course, which led her into work. At first, she joined Anro European, based in Cardiff Docks, then moved on to Keith Brown Shipping. By the time our story takes place, she was working as a shipping clerk for the Celtic or Celtic Shipping Company down in the Docklands. If you know Cardiff Docks at all, it's got a long history of graft and industry, and Geraldine fit right in. Her colleagues absolutely loved her. They said she was bright, cheerful, popular, just a brilliant worker all round. Her boss called her trustworthy, honest, and said she did a super job. He said she was irreplaceable after the tragic events I'm about to discuss. To everyone who knew her, she was a clean-living, hard-working, family-minded woman and the life and soul of the party. Her family adored her to pieces, and she adored them right back. She came from a proper, decent, respectable background, and like a lot of young people, she had her ups and downs in her love life too. She'd actually been engaged at one point to her boyfriend of 3 years, and they were meant to get married in April 1990. But she called it off in December 1989, pretty much a year to the day before this story's main timeline. Geraldine was a warm, sporty, loyal, lively young woman with a whole life ahead of her. And in the run-up to Christmas 1990, she was just going about her life like anyone else her age was, surrounded by family, friends and colleagues who thought the absolute world of her. As the Christmas week approached, Geraldine wasn't planning anything wild. She was single at that time, not involved with anyone, and she fancied more of a quiet one at home with her mum and dad. The only things on her festive calendar were her work's Christmas do and a Boxing Day trip to see Cinderella at the Panto with the family. She'd actually sorted the tickets out herself as a treat for Neil's kids. How thoughtful's that? On Friday, the 21st of December, she headed out for her work's annual Christmas party, as I'm sure many of you either have or are due to soon as you listen to this. She'd spent the day in the office sorting out the accounts, then left with her boss and 3 colleagues around 6 p.m. They started off the night's festivities at a pub in the city called The Bank, before wandering over to the Wine Press and later making their way to Jackson's nightclub on Westgate Street, arriving between 11 and 11:30 p.m. If you know Cardiff, that building is located right by what was at the time the old National Stadium. It's now the Principality Stadium, and Jackson's was massively popular in the 80s and 90s. It's long gone now, replaced with a Welsh rugby union shop, but back then it was one of the go-to spots for a night out. Sometime around midnight, Geraldine told her boss she was just nipping to the loo. As she headed off, none of her colleagues had a clue they'd never see her alive again. She wasn't the type of person to disappear without a word either. She told her parents she'd be coming home after the party, and if her plans changed, she'd ring to let them know. Of that there were no doubt. So when her mum Cynthia woke up on the Saturday morning and saw Geraldine's bedroom door shut, she assumed she got home safely and was still asleep, no doubt nursing a sore head. She even made her daughter a brew and went in her room to take it to her, but it was empty. Even so, Cynthia wasn't immediately panicking. She just thought Geraldine had maybe stayed at a mate's house, which wouldn't exactly be considered unusual for someone to do after a Christmas do. Les and Cynthia went out shopping that afternoon as they'd planned to, but upon their arrival home later on, there was still no sign of Geraldine. But again, they just assumed she'd call them when she got the chance. She was meant to be going shopping with Neil's wife that day, her sister-in-law, so they figured maybe she'd nipped home while they were out, got changed and headed back out herself. But around 12 hours after she was last seen, some kids, one paper specifically said it was an 11-year-old boy, made a horrifying discovery. Geraldine's body was found face down in Fairwater Brook, a small stream that runs right next to the playing fields by Fairwater Leisure Centre. The fields belong to a school that's gone through more name changes than you'd believe over the decades. Back then, it was Glantaf Welsh's lower school. Before that, Waterhole Secondary Modern. Today, it's a school whose name, I have no chance of pronouncing. Geraldine had been stabbed and beaten to death. She suffered more than 80 stab wounds in total, with her overall injury count being around 100. And this wasn't in some remote woodlands miles away. She was found just 100 yards from her own home, practically on her doorstep. Police later said the murder weapon was likely a very sharp, thin kitchen knife. They also believed a second object, maybe a stone or a brick, had been used in the attack, but they never found either of the weapons. Detective Chief Superintendent Phil Jones, the head of South Wales CID at the time, who himself would later be involved in a corruption scandal, but that's a story for another time, said there were clear signs Geraldine had fought back with everything she had. The struggle had covered a fair bit of ground across the playing field. In DCI Jones's words, it was the most brutal attack he'd ever been involved in investigating. Geraldine was semi-naked when she was found. The only item of clothing remaining on her body was a black camisole top. Her trousers, jacket and red coat had been removed. Some newspapers at the time immediately jumped to the idea of a sexual motive, but at a later inquest, Home Office pathologist Professor Bernard Knight said there was no evidence of a sexual assault taking place. DCI John Williams, who led the investigation, did say, however, that samples retrieved from Geraldine's body showed she had had sex with an unknown man shortly before her death, but whether that happened that night or early in the week, they couldn't tell. Professor Knight confirmed the primary cause of death was severe head injuries that resulted in brain damage, with the multiple knife wounds being a secondary cause. One thing is for certain though, and it's something the police laid their hopes on initially. Whoever killed Geraldine had dumped her body in the brook afterwards, and must have been absolutely covered in blood and mud when they left the scene. Surely someone would recall seeing their husband, boyfriend, brother, uncle, cousin, whatever male relation, if they'd been covered in blood and mud that night. That's pretty much all they had to go on. Now, the unenviable task of identifying Geraldine fell to her big brother Neil. He had to go to Cardiff Royal Infirmary and confirm it was her before heading to his parents' house and informing their mum and dad that their middle child had been murdered. After that, Neil took Les and Cynthia back to his house, unopened Christmas presents and all, because the idea of staying in that family home with all that waiting and hoping still hanging in the air must have been unbearable. Once news of Geraldine's death hit, the investigation moved fast. From the very start, detectives were honest about something. Nobody knew why she'd left the nightclub. Maybe she really had just nipped to the loo and planned to come back. Maybe she'd used it as a polite excuse to dip out without getting dragged into another round. I'm sure plenty of you listening have done that before. I know I have. She could even have arranged to meet someone or have been lured away. At that stage, everything was on the table. Naturally, the place detectives looked into first was her personal life. Could her killer have been someone she knew? A jealous ex, perhaps? A relationship gone wrong? You know as well as I do that 9 times out of 10 murder victims know their killer. The precise figure may be different, I appreciate that, but it certainly feels that way, doesn't it? So the fact Geraldine had broken off an engagement the previous December, it meant that line of inquiry was something that couldn't be ruled out. But detectives also couldn't rule out the possibility this was a random attack. House-to-house inquiries kicked off straight away in Fairwater. Taxi firms were quizzed as well, because the main question was, how had Geraldine got so close to home? If she'd left Jackson's around midnight, how did she end up 100 yards from her front door? On Christmas Eve, 2 days after her body was found, detectives said they had their first proper lead. Someone who knew Geraldine claimed they'd seen her standing in a city centre taxi queue at Castle Taxis. This was shortly before she was killed, and she was on her own. The queue was long, as you'd expect, with loads of people waiting for a lift home, but she wasn't stood with anyone she knew. That sighting pretty much confirmed she had made her excuses at Jackson's, left early, and was definitely heading home. Police pushed hard for information. A huge poster campaign went up around Cardiff on Christmas Eve, and they prepared to circulate photos of Geraldine at the 3 venues she'd visited that night. Over 100 detectives and uniformed officers were put on the case, and all Christmas leave were cancelled. It showed how seriously they were taking it, and how desperately they needed the public's help and support. By then, all Geraldine's clothes had been found. Her umbrella and her ripped coat were recovered just 20 yards from the back gate of her house on the edge of the playing fields. She'd been even closer to home than anybody first thought. Police also believe the noise of the attack must have been heard. Houses were right there around the field, and some locals reported hearing a single, horrible scream in the early hours. Detectives revealed that Geraldine hadn't walked home alone. She'd shared a taxi with 3 people. One was a friend, the other 2 were people that friend had either gone out with or met in the queue. And that does track. Sharing taxis after a night out, when it's cold, the queues are long, and the meter's running, it's not unusual. In hindsight, it seems a bit questionable, safety-wise, but back then it was normal, and again, I'm sure we've all done it. One man was dropped off near the Fairwater Hotel, with the driver then continuing the journey and eventually heading down Pentrabane Road, stopping at Waterhall Youth Centre, and that was where Geraldine asked to get out. It was about 12:50 AM when she exited the taxi, and she was only about 250 yards away from her house at that point. She likely wasn't dropped off at the door simply because the driver still had other passengers to sort out. It's another thing I'm certain we've all done. Just drop me here, mate, it's fine, especially when you don't want to make things awkward for everyone else in the back. But then came the sighting that really shook the investigation. Between 1:30 and 1:45 AM, a couple spotted a man running at speed near the youth centre, coming out of the field where Geraldine's body would later be found before jumping into a taxi. He flagged down a black Lada with a white bonnet, forcing the cab to actually turn into Bracken Place where Geraldine lived to pick him up. Police put out a full description of that mystery man. He was in his early 20s or 30s, around 5 foot 10 inches tall, clean-shaven, thick bushy eyebrows, medium build, neat hair, and wearing a quartered or checkered rugby jersey with light and dark blocks. If you're a rugby fan, you can already picture the type of jersey I'm on about. Think of a Battenberg cake pattern. I did try looking into which club shirts matched that description back in 1990, but I must admit, I did struggle. Historically, Cardiff RFC and Fairwater RFC both have had quartered strips in light and dark colours at some point. So, whoever that man was, chances are he was a local. Tracking the taxi was no easy task. Around 100 drivers in Cardiff were using Russian Ladas at the time, and 50 odd of them drove black and white ones matching that particular taxi's description, so identifying the exact driver was a needle in a haystack type job. Neil then made a public appeal on the 28th, begging people to come forward with information. As the calendar ticked over into 1991, the police were no closer to figuring out who'd murdered Geraldine. The case had gone quiet over Christmas, but on New Year's Day, her parents finally spoke out publicly for the first time. Just imagine how hard that must have been for them, talking about the daughter so soon after losing her in such a horrific way. A day later, South Wales police dropped a bit of a bombshell. They said they were desperate to speak to what they called a mystery boyfriend, someone they were convinced Geraldine had been seeing in the last week of her life. Yet DCS Jones said, "We don't know who the man is. It could be an old boyfriend or someone new." Basically, they had nothing. Just a hunch that someone out there knew her, was responsible for a murder, and wasn't coming forward. They also mentioned an anonymous caller who'd phoned the incident room on Boxing Day at 5:15 p.m. Whoever it was didn't leave their name and never rang back, which left the police practically begging him to get in touch again because they clearly thought this person knew something important. Around the same time, detectives reached out to Crime Watch, as was common back then. Crime Watch was at its peak in 1991. If your case went on there, you were reaching half the country. They filmed a reconstruction of Geraldine's last known movement and broadcast it on the February 14, 1991 episode. During the appeal, it was revealed a witness had seen something disturbing on the night Geraldine was killed. This witness, who was driving a car, said they saw a woman struggling with a man about 20 or 25 yards from where Geraldine's body was eventually found. This was around 1:20 in the morning on the Saturday. She said the man had the woman by the shoulders, pinning her back, and the pair of them were shouting at each other. The witness thought it looked like a lover's tiff, but the woman was trying desperately to pull away. She had dark, curly hair and looked a lot like Geraldine. The man was described as being somewhere between 21 and 35 years old and wearing a jacket of some sort. Again, nothing concrete, but it was the first real suggestion that someone might have seen her fighting for her life that night. Another bit of potential evidence then cropped up in mid-January. Police announced they'd found a key on the ground about 25 yards from Geraldine's discarded coat. And when I say the key was in mint condition, I mean it looked like it had just been cut. Police were convinced it had something to do with a struggle, and had the South Wales Echo print a full-size outline of the key so people could check it against their own. The Ilco key was made by a Canadian company, but it had been cut here as a copy. Police said it was the sort of thing you'd use for a double-glazed shop door, or maybe the bottom rail lock of a roller shutter. They thought it probably fit an Italian-made Vero lock, which you often find on commercial or industrial premises. It got them thinking about if the killer was someone who worked in a retail unit around there, maybe a shop fitter, a security guard, someone with access to such locks for reasons unknown. Detectives even raised the idea that whoever originally owned the key might have tried to get another copy made after the murder, assuming it was them who had dropped it. As in, maybe they suddenly realised they were missing one and needed to replace it ASAP. Crime Watch brought in about 60 calls in all, but almost all of them were about the key and didn't move the inquiry forward. By late January, a quick coroner's inquest was held and Geraldine's body was officially released back to her family. Dr. Lawrence Adicott, the coroner, recorded her death as unlawful killing. Geraldine was then laid to rest on January 31st. The cortege left her family home at 1 in the afternoon and she was buried at St. David's Church at 2:30. More than 1,000 people turned up apparently, and there wasn't an inch of space left inside the church according to reports. She was clearly loved by so many people. The family asked for donations to go to Latch, which is a Welsh children's cancer charity based at Llandoch Hospital, or to the British Heart Foundation. Given Geraldine's heart problems when she was younger and her mum working at that hospital, those choices made perfect sense. Not long after, her friends from the baseball team set up something called the Geraldine Palk Memorial Trophy. It was given to the Player of the Year in the Welsh Ladies Baseball League First Division, the league in which Geraldine had truly shone. It was a really sweet gesture from her teammates who clearly cared a lot about her and wanted to preserve her memory. By early February, detectives were getting pretty desperate. They announced they were planning to knock on the doors of 2,500 men, asking them to come in for what they called a genetic fingerprint test, basically a blood sample. It was only the second time this sort of mass screening had been used in the UK, with the samples being taken at Fairwater police station by doctors and nurses brought in specifically for the task at hand. By April, 900 men in Cardiff had given samples of the blood. By the end of that month, that figure was up to 1,000. The cost at that stage was around £100,000, and it quickly became the biggest and most expensive murder inquiry South Wales had ever seen. June soon rolled round, and that was when Neil went public again, once more begging for witnesses to come forward. 6 months had passed, and detectives were still no closer to catching the person who killed his sister. The frustration was there for all to see. All that work, all these appeals, all that money, yet no solid leads had come in. On December 19, 1991, just before the first anniversary of Geraldine's murder, a reward of £25,000 was put up by local business owners, including her former boss. That's around 58 grand in today's money when adjusted for inflation. 130 more calls came in on the back of that renewed appeal, but again, nothing cracked the case open, and then the trail just went completely cold. A full decade would pass without any progress. But before police ever got those new leads in the early 2000s, tragedy struck the Palk family again. Honestly, it's the kind of thing you wouldn't believe if it wasn't documented. In June 1995, Geraldine's mum Cynthia was crossing the road near the same playing fields where her daughter's body had been found, when out of nowhere she was hit by a car and killed. I couldn't believe it when I read that. My heart honestly sank. But the tragedies didn't end there. Just over 12 months later, in October 1996, Geraldine's dad Les died of liver cancer. Both of her parents passed away in the early 60s, neither of them getting to see justice for Geraldine. By then, the police had spent hundreds of thousands of pounds, tested over 1,000 men, appealed nationally for information, searched every inch of Fairwater, and still had no killer in their midst. And that's where things stayed, completely stuck, until the next major breakthrough came along 10 plus years after her murder. By the time we get to June 2001, at the turn of the millennium, this case had been running for more than a decade, and detectives were still grinding away in the background. They'd tested 5,000 men in Cardiff using DNA. 5,000! It was one of the biggest screenings the UK had ever seen. Then, suddenly, after all that time, money and effort, they finally got the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. A police spokesperson said something that month which basically hinted that something big was happening. They said, "There has been a major development despite the lapse of time. New technology is available now that wasn't available 10 years ago. We're confident an arrest will be made within days." And sure enough, a couple of days later, detectives announced they were heading down to Dartmoor Prison in Devon, not to follow up a lead, not to double-check something, but to actually speak to a man they believed was involved in Geraldine's murder. This guy hadn't featured in the investigation at all up to that point, not once. Still, police expected to arrest him at the gates of the prison the moment he was released after serving a 4-year stretch for GBH. After that, he'd be taken straight to Fairwater police station to be interviewed. The man in question was named as 34-year-old Mark Hampson, a carpet fitter from Taff's Well, just north of Cardiff. He was formally arrested on Friday, June 22, 2001. Detectives now had their prime suspect in custody. But what led them to Hampson, I hear you ask? Well, the police already had DNA from sperm recovered from Geraldine's body, but the huge screening program they'd run over the years hadn't matched it to anyone. In the lead up to Hampson's arrest, new DNA profiling techniques had confirmed a match. This came after the introduction of the DNA database in 1995, which meant that every single person arrested had to give a DNA sample. Assuming Hampson was sent to prison in the late 90s for his GBH conviction, he'll have had to do just that. The DNA match that nabbed him wasn't a vague, could be him, could be not sort of thing. The odds of it being anyone other than Hampson were 1 in a billion. His DNA matched the semen sample. People who knew Hampson didn't peg him as someone capable of something like this, which isn't necessarily surprising. People like him tend to hide their darker sides from the public, don't they? And they do it well. He grew up living in a quiet terrace street in Taftswell with his parents and sisters, attended the local primary school, then started an apprenticeship with the village butcher. He didn't finish the training though and eventually faded from village life altogether. Whenever people asked after him, they were just told he was working away. A local woman said it was pretty well known in the village that he'd done time in prison for injuring a man near his home. And then, years later, his face was suddenly on the billboards outside newsagents after he was arrested for the murder of Geraldine, one of the most shocking crimes South Wales had ever seen. When detectives sat him down after the arrest, Hampson didn't deny knowing a woman in Fairwater around the time of Geraldine's murder. He claimed he'd had a chance sexual encounter just before Christmas in 1990, but insisted they hadn't had full sex. He said she'd walked off alive and well, but when that claim didn't hold up, he changed his story. He later said he'd tried to have sex with Geraldine but couldn't, and that someone else must have killed her. He basically tried to argue that it was pure coincidence his sperm ended up inside her body. Hampson appeared before Cardiff magistrates on June 25, 2001 and was remanded in custody upon the hearing's conclusion. His case was set to go before Cardiff Crown Court for a preliminary hearing on July 4th. His murder trial eventually started in September 2002, but had to be restarted in October because a member of the original jury fell ill. When the new jury was sworn in, they were told the truth about what had happened to Geraldine. Her throat had been cut and she'd been beaten over the head with an object hard enough to fracture her skull. They also heard about cuts to her hands, defensive wounds that proved she'd tried desperately to protect herself. The prosecution told the jury that after Hampson was arrested, he told police about the sexual encounter he'd had as he walked home that night. He also claimed the woman had bitten him in the genitals, but said he didn't get any treatment for it. The latter part was a lie. Hospital records from Cardiff Royal Infirmary showed he had gone in on December 23, 1990 to receive treatment for that exact injury. He told the doctor his wife had bitten him while he was in the bath. But here's the thing, he didn't have a wife, and that was not how he'd been injured. The prosecution said that biting incident, whatever happened between him and Geraldine before then, was likely what triggered the violent knife-wielding rage that led to him killing her. Patrick Harrington, the prosecuting barrister, told the court that Hampson had threatened Geraldine with a knife and forced her to walk to the playing fields. Out there in the dark, he made her strip, sexually assaulted her, and then murdered her in a frenzied attack. Hampson's defense team went down the, quite frankly, despicable route of trying to attack Geraldine's character. They tried to paint her as someone who had casual relationships and frequent one-night stands with men. They dragged up mention of a mystery man she'd supposedly been seen with in a Cardiff nightclub hours before she died in a desperate attempt to shift blame away from Hampson and onto Geraldine. In the end, none of it worked. Hampson was found guilty of raping and murdering Geraldine and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years. Mrs. Justice Hallett handed that sentence down on November 4, 2002 at Bristol Crown Court. And the judge openly criticised the defence for focusing on Geraldine's private life instead of the facts. She said it was wrong and unnecessary, and she was spot on if you ask me. After the verdict, Hampson's lawyers tried to claim they hadn't been unfair and said their client was considering an appeal. They argued the trial judge had misdirected the jury, but the subsequent appeal was rejected exactly 2 years later on November 4, 2004. Hampson appealed again in January 2006 and lost that one too. Then, in mid-December 2007, almost 17 years to the day after he murdered Geraldine, Hampson died in the healthcare unit at Wakefield Prison. He was just 40 years old and had been reportedly suffering from a long-term illness. His death meant he never served even half of the minimum term he'd been handed, and it meant the living members of the Palk family never got any real sense of closure. A life sentence on paper, but nowhere near in reality. Looking back at this case now, over 30 years later, you realise just how much hurt and unanswered fear the Palk family had to shoulder. Geraldine did everything right that night. She finished work, she went for drinks with friends, she tried to get home safely, and yet she crossed paths with a man who saw her as nothing more than an opportunity to act on his own violence. What followed was a decade of frantic detective work, thousands of tests, appeals on national television, and an entire community holding its breath in the hope that someone, somewhere, would know something. And through all of that, Geraldine's family were living in the shadow of a nightmare, waiting for a name, and when that name was finally revealed, it didn't fix what had already been lost. Her parents never lived to see justice served, and her brother spent half his life pushing for answers that should not have taken 11 years to surface. Cases like this remind you that behind every headline and every police appeal, there's a real family trying to survive the aftermath. Geraldine's story stayed alive because people refused to forget her. And even now, decades later, the only thing that really matters is that we remember who she was, the life she should have had, and the people who loved her. Thanks so much for listening to or watching British Murders with Stuart Blues. Head to patreon.com/British Murders if you want to access ad-free episodes released a day early, plus a whole heap of exclusive content, including episodes not released on the main feed. Please consider giving British Murders a follow on your podcast player of choice. Make sure you're subscribed if you're watching on YouTube. It helps the show grow more than you'd believe, trust me. That's it for now. Until next time, cheerio.